No one prepares you for how unsettling it feels when an empath finally begins to awaken. It does not look like illumination. It does not arrive wrapped in serenity or spiritual confidence. Instead, it often begins with silence. The empath who once filled every emotional gap suddenly withdraws. They become quieter in rooms where they used to be the center of emotional gravity. They start declining invitations they once would have accepted without hesitation. They stop explaining themselves, and the people around them grow uneasy, even frightened, because the person who used to stabilize everyone else is no longer holding the structure together. Carl Jung spent decades observing this transformation, and what he discovered challenged the comforting myths surrounding awakening. He found that genuine psychological awakening in empaths rarely makes them more outwardly accommodating or endlessly compassionate. Quite the opposite. As awareness deepens, they become more selective about where they place their attention. Their empathy becomes boundaried rather than limitless. They allow others to face the consequences of their own emotional patterns instead of instinctively intervening to soften the impact. This shift is so profound that those who have known the empath for years often struggle to recognize them. Jung described this stage as an individuation crisis, unique to people who built their identities around meeting the needs of others. For someone who has spent most of their life defining themselves through usefulness and emotional availability, turning inward feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory. They begin to realize that much of the life they constructed was organized around external expectations rather than authentic desire. When this realization surfaces, it can feel like the ground beneath their identity is giving way. Awakening is not simply the adoption of new habits or the refinement of healthier coping mechanisms. It is the confrontation with a deeper truth that the self they presented to the world was shaped by survival rather than genuine self-expression. Jung observed that this moment of recognition often initiates a period of psychological unraveling. The empath senses that something inside them is changing irreversibly, even if they cannot yet articulate what that change means. The process usually begins with a form of exhaustion that cannot be resolved through ordinary rest. It is not merely physical fatigue. It is a pervasive depletion that sleep, vacations, or temporary self-care rituals fail to repair. After years of functioning as emotional regulators for the people around them, their internal resources begin to falter. They can no longer sustain the role of perpetual support. A quiet refusal emerges within the psyche, a refusal to continue operating in ways that once felt necessary for connection and belonging. To outside observers, this stage often resembles depression. The empath withdraws from relationships that once defined their social world. They respond more slowly to emotional demands. They seem less engaged in the dramas that previously activated their concern, yet Jung did not interpret this as pathology. He understood it as the psyche rejecting an outdated structure. What appears to be collapse is, in fact, the first movement toward psychological health, the moment when a lifelong pattern of automatic yes begins to transform into a conscious and necessary no. To understand why this awakening feels so destabilizing, Jung insisted that we must first understand what the empath is actually awakening from. He did not view empathic sensitivity as a simple gift that only needed refinement. In many cases, he saw it as the result of a psychological adaptation formed very early in life. The empath's identity, he observed, was often built around a silent agreement they made with the world long before they had the language to describe it, the belief that their value depended on what they could provide emotionally for others. This belief was rarely conscious. It did not emerge as a deliberate philosophy. It developed as a survival strategy. The child who learned that affection was inconsistent or conditional began to monitor the emotional climate around them with extraordinary precision. They discovered that soothing tension, anticipating needs, or becoming useful could restore a fragile sense of safety. Over time, this responsiveness became automatic. What began as a protective mechanism gradually shaped the entire architecture of the personality. Jung noted that such adaptations are remarkably effective during childhood. They create connection. They maintain belonging. They help the child feel necessary in environments where necessity may be the only currency of love. Yet this effectiveness carries a hidden cost. As the empath matures, the authentic aspects of their inner life, their spontaneous desires, their genuine anger, their instinctive boundaries are pushed further into the unconscious. These qualities do not disappear. They become buried beneath the performance of perpetual availability. Because the performance is practiced for years, even decades, it eventually feels indistinguishable from identity. The empath comes to believe that constant emotional attunement is simply who they are. Jung emphasized that this is precisely why awakening often feels violent when it finally arrives. It is not merely the correction of a habit. It is the recognition that an entire way of being was constructed in response to fear of disconnection. The realization can be deeply disorienting. The person they thought they were may have been a role they inhabited so convincingly that they forgot it was a role at all. When this recognition surfaces, the psyche begins to dismantle the structures that once ensured psychological survival. Jung observed that the first signs of this dismantling frequently appear as profound inner fatigue. The empath discovers they can no longer absorb the emotional turbulence of everyone around them. Situations that once triggered immediate caretaking responses now evoke resistance or numbness. There is a growing awareness that continuing to function in the old way would require betraying something essential within themselves. From the outside, this withdrawal can appear sudden and inexplicable. Friends or family members may interpret it as indifference or rejection. Yet internally, the empath is navigating a confrontation with the unconscious. Jung described this phase as the beginning of shadow emergence. Contrary to popular imagery, the empath's shadow is rarely dominated by cruelty or aggression. Instead, it contains the very elements they were taught to suppress: their own needs, their unexpressed resentment, their desire for solitude, their capacity to say no without justification. As these qualities move toward consciousness, they challenge the empath's long-standing self-concept. Expressing honest limits may feel like an act of betrayal against the identity they carefully maintained. A simple statement such as, "I don't have the energy to listen right now," can provoke intense guilt, not because the empath lacks compassion, but because they have equated self-protection with moral failure. Jung observed that integrating this shadow material requires enduring a period in which authenticity is frequently misunderstood by others as hostility. The social consequences of this shift can be severe. Individuals who relied on the empath's constant emotional labor may react with confusion or anger. They may accuse the empath of becoming distant, selfish, or cold. For someone whose deepest fear has always been the loss of connection, these reactions strike at the core of their psychological defenses. The temptation to revert to familiar patterns, to resume performing the role that ensured approval, becomes almost overwhelming. Jung believed this stage represents a decisive threshold. If the empath retreats into their previous identity to restore external harmony, the awakening process often pauses or reverses. However, if they remain present with the discomfort, a deeper transformation unfolds. What initially feels like social loss begins to reveal itself as psychological liberation. The empath gradually recognizes that relationships sustained through self-erasure were never fully reciprocal. This recognition is rarely intellectual. It is experienced viscerally, accompanied by waves of grief for the years spent giving more than they were able to receive. Grief, Jung emphasized, is not a sign that the awakening is misguided. It is evidence that the psyche is recalibrating its understanding of attachment and value. The empath mourns not only specific relationships, but also the familiarity of being needed. That role, even when exhausting, provided clarity. It offered a defined place in the emotional ecosystem of their world. Letting go of it can feel like stepping into uncertainty without a map. Yet within this uncertainty lies the beginning of genuine individuation. As the empath withdraws projections they once placed on others, they start to perceive relational dynamics with new accuracy. They notice imbalances that previously seemed normal. They recognize how often their sensitivity was interpreted as compliance rather than depth. These realizations can ignite anger, not necessarily toward others alone, but toward themselves, for participating in patterns that diminished their authenticity. Jung cautioned against bypassing this anger in the name of premature forgiveness. Attempting to move too quickly into understanding or compassion can become another form of self-suppression. The psyche requires space to acknowledge the full emotional truth of what has been experienced. Only by allowing these feelings to surface can the empath release the unconscious contracts that once governed their interactions. As this phase progresses, a subtle but significant shift begins to occur. The empath notices moments of unexpected vitality. Energy that was once diffused across countless obligations starts to return. Creative impulses re-emerge. Decisions that were postponed for years suddenly feel possible. Jung described this resurgence as the restoration of psychic libido, the life force that fuels engagement with one's own path rather than constant immersion in the emotional narratives of others. This reallocation of energy marks the early stages of rebuilding. The empath is not becoming less sensitive. They are becoming more internally anchored. Their awareness, once scattered outward, begins to gather around the center of their own experience. Though the process is accompanied by uncertainty and relational upheaval, it signals that the psyche is moving away from survival-based identity toward a more integrated and self-directed existence. As the empath continues moving through this awakening, the most decisive psychological transformation begins to take shape. Jung observed that once the initial shock of identity collapse and the confrontation with shadow material have been endured, a new faculty gradually develops within the psyche. He described this faculty as integrated discernment, the ability to perceive emotional reality clearly without being unconsciously compelled to absorb or resolve it. Before awakening, empathic sensitivity often functions like an open channel with no regulating mechanism. Every emotional signal in the environment registers with equal urgency. The empath feels responsible for restoring equilibrium wherever tension appears. They struggle to distinguish between authentic distress and subtle forms of manipulation. Their awareness is acute, yet it is not directed by conscious choice. It is driven by conditioned reflex. After awakening, sensitivity itself does not diminish. If anything, it becomes more refined. The crucial difference is that perception is now filtered through a more cohesive sense of self. The empath begins to experience a separation between feeling something and being obligated to act on it. They can recognize sadness in another person without automatically assuming the role of healer. They can sense frustration, guilt, or anxiety in a conversation without internalizing it as their responsibility to resolve. This shift can feel disorienting at first. The empath is accustomed to measuring their worth through usefulness. When they stop intervening in every emotional disturbance, they may question whether they are becoming indifferent. Jung emphasized that this uncertainty is part of the reorganization process. The psyche is learning a new way of relating, one that honors perception without sacrificing autonomy. With discernment, comes a more accurate assessment of relational dynamics. The empath begins to see patterns that were previously obscured by habitual caretaking. They notice how certain interactions revolve around extraction rather than reciprocity. They recognize that some individuals were drawn to their availability more than to their authentic presence. This recognition is rarely dramatic or confrontational. It unfolds through a quiet accumulation of insights that gradually alter how the empath participates in their social world. As boundaries solidify, relationships inevitably undergo restructuring. Some connections deepen because they are able to adapt to the empath's evolving authenticity. Others dissolve because they were sustained primarily by imbalance. Jung was clear that this stage involves tangible loss. Friendships may fade, family dynamics may become strained, the empath may find themselves spending extended periods in solitude, not as an escape, but as a necessary environment for integration. Solitude, in this context, is not isolation in the pathological sense. It is a psychological space where previously suppressed aspects of the self can emerge without interference. Jung regarded such periods as essential for individuation. When the empath is no longer preoccupied with managing the emotional expectations of others, they begin to encounter parts of their inner world that were neglected for years. Creative interests resurface. Intellectual curiosity strengthens. Personal desires, once dismissed as selfish or impractical, start to claim legitimacy. This reorientation of energy often produces a paradoxical combination of empowerment and vulnerability. On one hand, the empath experiences a growing sense of clarity and agency. Decisions that once felt impossible become achievable because they are no longer filtered through the question of how others will react. On the other hand, the dismantling of familiar roles removes a source of psychological security. The empath must learn to tolerate ambiguity as they construct a new identity that is not contingent on constant approval. Jung described this phase as a form of symbolic death and rebirth. The identity organized around compulsive caretaking gradually dissolves, making room for a more differentiated personality structure. This does not mean the empath loses their capacity for compassion. Rather, compassion becomes a conscious choice instead of an automatic obligation. Love is expressed with greater depth because it is no longer entangled with fear of rejection or guilt over self-protection. As this transformation stabilizes, the empath's perceptual abilities often take on a new quality. Jung observed that individuals who completed this integration developed a striking level of psychological insight. Their sensitivity, once experienced as a burden, becomes an instrument for navigating complex interpersonal realities. They are able to assess motivations, tensions, and emotional undercurrents with remarkable precision, yet remain grounded in their own perspective. To those still operating from unconscious patterns, this presence can feel unsettling. The awakened empath is no longer performing the familiar role of mediator or emotional caretaker. Their authenticity exposes discrepancies in others' behavior without requiring explicit confrontation. People may sense this shift intuitively, even if they cannot articulate what has changed. Some respond by distancing themselves, not because the empath has become hostile, but because genuine self-possession disrupts relational dynamics built on unspoken expectations. Throughout this stage, grief continues to surface intermittently. The empath mourns not only the relationships that have transformed or ended, but also the version of themselves that once felt indispensable. That identity, despite its limitations, provided a sense of belonging. Letting it go can evoke nostalgia alongside relief. Jung stressed that acknowledging this ambivalence is vital. Integration is not achieved by denying the comfort that old patterns once offered, but by understanding why they can no longer serve psychological growth. Gradually, a new equilibrium emerges. The empath begins to experience connection without self-erasure. They participate in relationships from a position of mutual recognition rather than one-sided responsibility. Their emotional awareness becomes a resource that enhances discernment rather than overwhelming it. The life they are building may appear quieter from the outside, yet internally it is characterized by greater coherence and authenticity. Jung considered this outcome one of the most significant expressions of individuation. The empath who has endured the upheaval of awakening and the solitude of reconstruction acquires a form of inner authority that cannot be conferred by external validation. Their sense of identity is rooted in direct experience rather than in roles adopted to maintain acceptance. While the process demands courage and patience, it ultimately allows the empath to inhabit their sensitivity as a strength aligned with self-knowledge. By the time this awakening reaches its later stages, the empath begins to recognize that what once felt like collapse was, in reality, a profound psychological correction. The dismantling of familiar roles, the loss of certain relationships, and the periods of disorientation were not signs that something had gone wrong. They were signs that the psyche was reorganizing itself around truth rather than survival. Jung emphasized that individuation is rarely comfortable because it requires relinquishing identities that once ensured belonging, even when those identities quietly undermined authenticity. The awakened empath moves through the world with a different quality of presence. They are not less compassionate than before. In many ways, they are capable of deeper love. The difference is that their compassion is no longer driven by compulsion or fear. It arises from conscious choice. They are honest about what they can carry and what they must allow others to face on their own. Their relationships may become fewer in number, yet they gain substance. Connection is no longer sustained through silent self-sacrifice, but through mutual recognition and respect. Jung observed that this shift often challenges people who remain attached to unconscious relational patterns. The empath's refusal to perform the old role can feel threatening to those who benefited from it. Without intending confrontation, the awakened individual begins to illuminate inconsistencies in the social fabric around them. Authenticity has a way of revealing performance simply by existing alongside it. As a result, some individuals withdraw, sensing that the dynamic they once relied upon can no longer be maintained. For the empath, these changes evoke a complex mixture of relief and grief. They mourn the familiarity of being needed, even while recognizing that constant necessity was unsustainable. They mourn the simplicity of knowing exactly who they were expected to be. At the same time, they discover a new form of belonging, one that does not require abandoning their own emotional reality to preserve connection. Jung regarded this discovery as one of the most psychologically stabilizing outcomes of the awakening process. The individual learns that genuine attachment can coexist with clear boundaries. He also cautioned that this transformation cannot be rushed. Attempts to bypass the discomfort of grief or the uncertainty of rebuilding often result in a return to earlier patterns. The psyche requires time to integrate what has been revealed. Each phase of awakening, exhaustion, confrontation with the shadow, relational restructuring, and the emergence of discernment contributes to a gradual consolidation of the self. When these stages are honored rather than resisted, the empath eventually experiences a sense of inner continuity that was absent before. In Jung's view, this awakening is not a luxury reserved for the spiritually inclined. It is a developmental necessity for individuals whose identities were shaped by chronic self-neglect. Without it, they risk spending their lives maintaining connections that depend on emotional extraction rather than reciprocity. With it, They reclaim the capacity to direct their sensitivity inward toward their own healing and creative unfolding. What others may interpret as withdrawal or detachment is, in fact, the empath's return to psychological ownership of their inner world. Those who complete this process often arrive at a quiet but unwavering conviction. They would not choose to return to the person they once were, even if that earlier identity was more widely accepted or understood. The version of themselves that emerges more boundaried, more discerning, more integrated, reflects a level of self-realization that justifies the upheaval required to reach it. Awakening, in this sense, is not about transcendence in a mystical or idealized form. It is about becoming real after years of performing a role designed to secure love. For anyone moving through this transition, Jung's observations offer reassurance. The instability you feel does not signal failure. It signals movement toward wholeness. Your life is reorganizing itself around who you genuinely are, rather than who you believed you had to be. Though the journey involves loss, it also opens the possibility of connection that is grounded in truth. And in that truth, the empath discovers a form of strength that no longer depends on being indispensable to others, but on being fully present within themselves.